And right here, we're facing it in Idaho. Just 2007, just a few years ago, was the biggest fire year here in Idaho since the historic fires of 1910. I was involved with some assessments of fire effects at the Cascade Complex, just north of here. Burned 300,000 acres, cost over $40 million to suppress. Just north of that was the East Zone Complex, another 300,000 acres and over $30 million to suppress. And then south of here you had the Murphy Complex, which is even bigger. So this is costing a lot of money, and in fact, over the last 10 years, the Forest Service budget has just ballooned to fight fires. Well, about half the Forest Service budget now is just to fight fires. That trend is expected to continue given the current climate trends. And also, very importantly, and the last point I want to make is our own decisions on where we're building houses. The wildland-urban interface has become the hot-button issue in the Forest Service because we have become charged with the task of defending homes from burning down. And that's what makes fire suppression so very expensive. And as the wildland, as people build more and more into ecosystems that are adapted to burn, there's going to be more conflict and more controversy about how to keep these homes from burning down.
At one point in our history, we knew very little about the way groundwater and surface water interacts. And then lo and behold, we find out that all of these wells that have been drilled on the eastern Snake Plain aquifer are actually depleting flows in the Snake River. And now we have disputes, surface waters users against groundwater users. And there are 3 separate legal proceedings going on, all of them in various stages before the Idaho Supreme Court.
The effort used to be to say, what trait, what characteristic of organisms or communities allow them to be invaded? And now what we recognize as the most important process is probably a thing called propagular pressure. How many individuals, how many times is something introduced into an area? And at some point it might not succeed, but if there's more and more efforts to move that thing that's transporting more and more individuals, seeds, propagules, then that can become an invasive species. So humans are what really drive invasions through this process called propagular pressure. So this organism is now in its new territory. And what do these things do? They reduce native species biodiversity. They alter community structure. One of the logical progressions of reduced biodiversity is actually extinctions. What literature suggests is that global change is going to have its largest impacts in Mediterranean climates and in grassland ecosystems. So that brings us right here to southern Idaho, because southern Idaho is sagebrush steppe, really beautiful natural communities of sagebrush and grasses and forbs. But as you drive between here and Mountain Home, think about how much of that you actually see. And what we see in this area on the Snake River Plains is a total conversion of an area that used to have native species to one dominated by invasive, mostly annual grasses. And those species have altered the fire frequency in this area. They've also altered the fire intensity in this area. So fires now burn larger, hotter than they ever did before.
It's been many generations since we've lived with wolves. And so all of those stories that we grew up with, things like Little Red Riding Hood and the 3 Little Pigs and all that, those have a tremendous impact on us because we hear them at a very, very early age. And that's our relationship with wolves, absent the actual animal in the backcountry. Part of my undergraduate research was to go to Minnesota, where there are 3,000 wolves in the northern part of the state. Far more conservative traded population of wolves than what we have here in the western United States. And part of my efforts there were to find out what people thought about wolves. How did they feel about having wolves around them? And because I was asking questions and not really explaining too much about my research at the time, people felt very compelled to tell me that I was going to be safe, that wolves were no big deal. About 2 million visitors a year that go up into the boundary waters every year. They are not armed with anything more than probably a canoe paddle, and just a real piece about it, of hearing wolves.
You talk about ugly. There's not much good, there's a lot of ugly, and there's a whole lot that's controversial. And it happens at scales all the way from global to local watersheds here in Idaho. So I think to summarize what has happened in the salmon and steelhead world, when Lewis and Clark came into this country, the Columbia River was having annual runs of fish that were running somewhere between about 9 and 15 million fish per year. The Snake River itself, the Snake River Basin, including down right here through Marsing and up to Twin Falls, was the world's largest producer of both fall Chinook and spring Chinook. And clearly the largest producer of spring Chinook. They come almost exclusively from the Snake Basin system. And right now, wild fish in that are about 1% of what they were at the time Lewis and Clark came through. The runs are about 90% hatchery origin. And there are a slew of papers that have come out in the last 5 years that are documenting that hatchery fish don't perform like wild fish.